People think a human life ends with a gunshot or a bomb, the old rancher would say years later, staring across fields that had long since turned green again. But sometimes a life almost ends in something quieter, like heat. The morning had begun before the sun cleared the horizon, the way mornings always did on that cotton farm in eastern Texas during the war years. By 6 o'clock the sky was already pale blue, and the air carried the promise of heat that would press down like a heavy hand by noon. Rows of cotton stretched across the land in endless white lines, the plants waist-high, the soil dry and cracked beneath boots that had walked those same rows for decades. The farm belonged to a family that had worked the land since before the First World War, but in 1944 the place felt different. Too quiet in some ways, too busy in others. The young men who used to work the fields were gone, scattered across Europe and the Pacific wearing uniforms instead of denim. In their place were older farmers, hired hands, and a small group of German prisoners of war who arrived each weekday morning in the back of an army truck. They came in silence most days, not because anyone ordered them to be quiet, but because silence had become a habit. The war had a way of teaching people that speaking too much could be dangerous. That morning the truck rolled to a stop beside the dirt road at the edge of the cotton fields just as the sun climbed over a line of oak trees in the distance. Dust lifted behind the tires and drifted slowly through the air. One by one the women stepped down from the back of the truck. There were 6 of them that day, all wearing the same faded gray prison uniforms with small black letters stamped on the cloth. POW, prisoner of war. They were young and not so young. Some looked barely 20. Others carried the quiet exhaustion of people who had seen too much before their time. They adjusted their hats against the rising sun and followed the foreman into the fields where canvas sacks waited beside each row of cotton. Among them was a woman named Anna Weiss. She was 27 years old and originally from a town near the Rhine River, though that felt like another lifetime now. Before the war, she had studied nursing in a small hospital that smelled of antiseptic and fresh bread from the bakery next door. The war had rearranged that life piece by piece until she found herself standing in a cotton field nearly 5,000 miles from home. Anna was not the tallest of the group, but there was something about the way she held herself that made people notice her anyway. Her back stayed straight even after hours in the sun. Her movements were careful and precise, like someone who had trained her hands to work steadily no matter how tired she felt. The other women followed her rhythm without realizing it sometimes, moving down the rows together as if the cotton plants themselves had taught them how to work in quiet coordination. At the far end of the field a man leaned against a wooden fence watching the truck disappear down the road. His name was Ethan Walker, 32 years old, born on the same patch of Texas land where he now stood. He wore a wide-brimmed hat that had faded from brown to almost gray after years of sun and dust. His shirt sleeves were rolled up and his hands carried the rough calluses of someone who had fixed fences, saddled horses, and lifted hay bales since he was old enough to walk across a barn floor. Ethan had grown up in a world where the horizon looked endless and problems were solved with steady work rather than long conversations. The war had not taken him overseas the way it had taken so many others. A damaged knee from a horse accident years earlier meant the army had no use for him as a soldier. Instead, he stayed behind, working the land while the world beyond Texas seemed to burn in newspapers and radio broadcasts. At first, he had not liked the idea of prisoners working the farm. Most people around town didn't know what to think about Germans living behind fences in camps just a few miles away. But the cotton didn't wait for opinions, and the harvest didn't care about politics. So Ethan watched them the way he watched weather moving across the plains, carefully, quietly, trying to understand something unfamiliar without making it worse. That morning the women moved into the rows and began picking cotton the way they had been taught during the past few weeks. Pull the white fibers clean from the plant. Drop them into the canvas sack. Move one step forward. Repeat. The rhythm of the work soon filled the field. Leaves rustled softly. Canvas sacks dragged over dry soil. Somewhere in the distance a meadowlark called once and then fell silent again. The sun rose higher. By 9 o'clock the heat had begun its slow climb. Texas heat was not dramatic the way storms were dramatic. It did not arrive suddenly with thunder and lightning. It simply grew heavier with each passing hour until even breathing felt like drawing air through warm cloth. Ethan walked along the edge of the field, checking fence posts and water jugs placed beneath a small patch of shade. He did not say much to the women. None of them expected him to. Sometimes he nodded in greeting when their eyes met. Sometimes they nodded back. That was usually enough. But sometime after 10 o'clock, he noticed something different. At first it was only a small change in rhythm. One of the figures in the rows had slowed slightly, then slowed again. Ethan paused beside the fence and narrowed his eyes against the sunlight. Anna Weiss had been moving steadily all morning, but now her steps were not matching the others. She paused longer between plants. Her shoulders dipped forward as if the invisible weight of the heat had suddenly become real. From where he stood, Ethan could see her raise a hand briefly to her forehead before returning it to the cotton sack. The gesture was small enough that most people might have missed it entirely. But years of watching cattle and horses had taught him how to recognize the moment when a body was beginning to reach its limit. He pushed away from the fence and started walking toward the rows. Not fast. Not yet. Just curious enough to move closer. The sun hung high now, bright enough that the white cotton almost glowed against the green leaves. The air shimmered above the soil. Anna took another step forward and reached for the next plant. For a moment, everything looked normal again. Her hand closed around the cotton fibers. She dropped them into the sack. Then she took one more step. The ground beneath her boots tilted slightly, though no one else could see it. The horizon wavered. The sunlight seemed to stretch into long white streaks. Anna blinked once, trying to steady herself. She had learned during the war that weakness was something people noticed quickly, and once they noticed it, they rarely forgot. So she tried to keep moving. One more plant. One more handful of cotton. One more step. But the heat had already made its quiet decision. Her fingers loosened around the cotton. The sack slipped from her shoulder. For one suspended second, she stood perfectly still in the middle of the row, as if the world had paused to watch what would happen next. Then her knees gave way, and she collapsed into the soft dust between the plants while the white cotton around her swayed gently in the rising Texas heat. For a moment no one moved. The cotton plants rustled softly in the dry breeze, their white fibers trembling in the sunlight, as if the field itself had taken a quiet breath. Anna Weiss lay on the ground between the rows, her gray sleeve half buried in dust the color of pale clay. The canvas sack that had rested against her shoulder only seconds before had fallen beside her, its mouth open, spilling cotton across the soil like a small cloud that had lost its way. Somewhere nearby, one of the other women whispered her name in German, but the words seemed to dissolve in the heavy heat before it could travel very far. A few yards away, Ethan Walker had already begun to run. It was not a dramatic sprint the way men ran during emergencies in town, waving arms and shouting instructions. It was the fast, steady run of someone who had spent his life crossing open land, someone who understood instinctively that hesitation could make a small problem turn into a dangerous one. His boots struck the dry earth with dull thuds as he moved between the cotton rows. The plants brushed against his legs as he passed, their leaves warm from the rising sun. From a distance the scene must have looked strangely peaceful, almost slow, like a quiet photograph of farm work in summer. But up close Ethan could see the signs he had noticed before. The shallow breathing. The way Anna's hand had curled loosely against the soil instead of bracing to catch her fall. By the time he reached her side, the other women had stepped back a few feet, unsure whether they should help or wait. None of them had been given instructions for a moment like this. War had taught them many rules, but none about what to do when a body simply gave out beneath the weight of heat and exhaustion. Ethan dropped to one knee beside her, the brim of his hat casting a narrow patch of shade across her face. Up close he could see how pale her skin had become beneath the layer of dust and sunlight. Her lips were slightly parted. Her breathing came in shallow pulls that seemed too slow for the blazing morning around them. He removed his hat without thinking and held it above her face, widening the shadow. It was a small gesture, almost automatic, something he had done before for calves or horses that had collapsed during summer drives. But there was something different about doing it here, in the middle of a cotton field, for someone who had arrived on the farm wearing the letters prisoner of war across her uniform. He reached toward her shoulder and spoke quietly. Anna. The name felt unfamiliar in his voice, shaped by a German accent he had only heard a few times when the women spoke among themselves. There was no response. The field remained silent except for the distant hum of cicadas beginning their midday chorus in the oak trees beyond the fence. Ethan glanced over his shoulder toward the water station set beneath the thin shade of a mesquite tree about 40 yards away. A metal jug stood there beside a stack of tin cups, the surface of the jug reflecting the sun like a mirror. He pointed toward it. Water. Quickly. One of the women understood the gesture and ran toward the tree, her boots kicking up dust as she crossed the narrow path between the rows. Ethan turned back to Anna. He loosened the collar of her gray work shirt carefully, not pulling too hard, just enough to let the trapped heat escape from her neck. The fabric was warm from the sun. A small bead of sweat rolled slowly along her temple and disappeared into the dust beneath her hairline. He placed 2 fingers lightly against the inside of her wrist the way he had seen a doctor do once when a ranch hand fainted during branding season years earlier. The pulse was there, steady but faint. That was enough to make him exhale quietly. Around them the cotton field seemed to hold its breath. The other prisoners watched from a distance of a few steps, their faces tight with uncertainty. None of them spoke. In the camp, they had learned that too many questions could create problems for everyone. A minute later the woman who had run for water returned, carrying the metal jug with both hands. The tin cup hanging from the handle rattled softly with each step. Ethan took it and filled the cup halfway, then paused. He had seen animals refuse water when they were frightened or confused. People were not so different sometimes. So instead of lifting the cup immediately to Anna's lips, he drank a small swallow himself. The water was warm, tasting faintly of metal and dust, but it was real water, and it would do its job. He set the cup down beside her and dipped the corner of a handkerchief into the jug. Slowly he pressed the damp cloth against her forehead. The change in temperature was small, but noticeable. The cloth cooled the heat trapped in her skin, and a moment later Anna's eyelids fluttered slightly. Ethan waited. Patience was something ranch life had taught him well. When you rushed animals, or storms, or injured hands, things tended to get worse instead of better. So he stayed where he was, kneeling in the dust beside her while the shade of his hat followed the movement of the sun inch by inch. A few seconds later Anna drew a deeper breath. Her fingers twitched slightly against the soil. Then her eyes opened halfway. At first she did not seem to understand where she was. The world above her was a bright blue sky framed by cotton leaves and the silhouette of a cowboy hat held above her face. For a moment she blinked slowly, as if trying to separate a dream from the hard brightness of morning. Then the memory returned all at once. The field, the heat, the work sacks, the sudden dizziness that had swept through her body like a wave she could not step away from. Her eyes widened slightly, and she tried to sit up too quickly. Ethan raised one hand gently, not touching her, only signaling for her to stay still. Easy. The word came out. Quiet and calm. The tone he might have used with a young horse frightened by thunder. You are all right. Anna looked at him with confusion that had not yet sorted itself into fear or relief. The war had taught her that kindness from strangers often carried a hidden cost. She saw the cup of water beside her and hesitated. Ethan understood the hesitation the moment it appeared in her expression. So he picked up the cup again and took another small drink before offering it back. The gesture was simple. No speeches. No explanations. Just proof that the water was safe and that the man kneeling beside her was not trying to trick her into anything. After a moment Anna reached out slowly and took the cup with trembling fingers. She drank carefully at first, only a sip, then another. The water ran cool across her tongue despite the heat of the jug. Her shoulders relaxed slightly as the dryness in her throat eased. Around them the cotton field returned to motion again. One of the women picked up the fallen sack and shook the dust from it. Another stepped quietly back into the row where the work had stopped. Ethan remained where he was a moment longer, watching Anna's breathing grow steadier. The sun continued its climb toward noon, bright and relentless, but the shadow from his hat still rested across her face. And in that small circle of shade the war felt very far away. Anna Weiss held the tin cup in both hands for several seconds after the last sip of water was gone. The metal felt warm from the sun, yet the small amount of water that had passed her lips seemed to move slowly through her body like a quiet signal that life had not entirely abandoned her strength. Her breathing steadied little by little. The tight pressure that had wrapped itself around her chest began to loosen. For a moment, she simply sat in the dust between the rows of cotton, the white plants surrounding her like silent witnesses. The field stretched in every direction under the wide Texas sky, endless rows broken only by the distant fence line and a thin stand of oak trees that trembled in the heat haze. Ethan Walker remained kneeling beside her, not too close and not too far away. He had shifted his hat slightly so that its shadow still covered her face while the sunlight climbed higher above them. The brim cast a moving circle of shade across the soil, and inside that circle the air felt just barely cooler than the open field. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Words had a way of making situations complicated when quiet patience could solve them more gently. Anna lowered the empty cup slowly and looked down at her hands. They were trembling faintly, the kind of trembling that comes when the body has pushed itself beyond the edge of what it can safely carry. Dust clung to the lines of her fingers and the backs of her knuckles. A thin smear of soil marked the sleeve of her gray uniform where she had fallen. She brushed it away absent-mindedly. Ethan noticed the movement and reached for the water jug again. He poured another small portion into the tin cup and set it beside her within easy reach. He did not hand it directly to her this time. He simply placed it near enough that she could choose when to drink again. The gesture carried the same quiet respect he had shown a few minutes earlier. Anna noticed it immediately. War had sharpened her awareness of such things. In the hospitals where she once worked, there had been soldiers who barked orders even when they were supposed to be helping patients. There had also been doctors who spoke gently and stepped back, allowing the injured to keep some measure of dignity. The difference between those two kinds of men could change the entire feeling of a room. She lifted the cup again and drank a little more slowly than before. The water slid down her throat, and with it came the faint smell of warm metal and mesquite leaves drifting from the tree where the jug had stood in the shade. Around them the field had resumed its rhythm. The other prisoners had returned to their rows, though they worked more slowly now, glancing toward Anna from time to time. None of them spoke loudly. They understood that the moment carried a kind of fragile balance that loud voices might disturb. Cotton sacks dragged softly across the soil again. Leaves rustled in the breeze that had begun to move gently through the plants. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, brushing dust from his knee. "You should sit. A little longer," he said quietly. "The heat is not finished yet." Anna looked at him with careful attention, searching his expression the way a person studies unfamiliar territory before taking the first step forward. His face carried the calm patience of someone who had spent years working outdoors, someone accustomed to weather that could not be hurried or argued with. His eyes did not carry suspicion or judgment. They simply watched to make sure she remained steady. After a moment, she nodded once. "Thank you," she said softly. Her English carried the gentle accent of the Rhine Valley, each word shaped carefully, as though she had rehearsed it many times in her mind before speaking aloud. Ethan gave a small nod in return, the kind of acknowledgement people exchange when gratitude feels unnecessary but appreciated all the same. The sun continued its climb toward noon. Heat waves shimmered above the rows of cotton, bending the distant fence posts into wavy shapes that looked almost like reflections on water. A cicada buzzed somewhere in the oak trees, and then another answered farther down the fence line. The sound rose and fell like a slow mechanical rhythm that belonged entirely to summer in the American South. Anna leaned back slightly, bracing one hand against the soil while the dizziness inside her head settled into something manageable. Her vision cleared enough that she could see the horizon again without the strange white flashes that had filled her sight earlier. She watched Ethan for a moment as he stood and brushed the dust from his trousers. He moved with the unhurried steadiness of someone who had grown up under open skies. There was no sign of impatience in the way he waited for her to recover. He simply stood there, hat in hand, allowing the shadow to fall across her face until she seemed ready to move again. "In Germany," she said after a few moments, "the summers are warm, but not like this." Ethan tilted his head slightly, considering the words before answering. "Texas heat can surprise people," he replied. "Even folks who have lived here all their lives sometimes forget what it can do." Anna gave a faint smile at that, though the expression faded quickly as another breeze stirred the cotton leaves around them. She glanced across the rows where the other women worked. The sight of them bending and straightening beneath the sun reminded her how close she had come to being carried away from the field instead of resting in it. "I thought I could keep going," she said quietly. Ethan rested one hand against the wooden handle of a cotton sack lying nearby. Most people do, he said. The sun has a way of proving otherwise. Another moment passed in silence. Then Anna shifted her feet beneath her and slowly pushed herself upright. She stood carefully, testing her balance the way a person tests a bridge before trusting it completely. The dizziness had mostly faded, replaced by a dull fatigue that felt manageable if she moved slowly. Ethan watched without stepping closer. When she stood steadily for several seconds, he placed the hat back on his head and adjusted the brim against the sunlight. You do not have to rush back to the rose, he said. Sit under the mesquite tree if you need more shade. Anna looked toward the tree where the water jug waited. The small patch of shade beneath its branches seemed almost luxurious compared to the open field. But she shook her head gently. I can work again soon, she said. Just slower. Ethan studied her for a moment and then gave a small nod. Slower is usually wiser anyway. Anna lifted the canvas sack from the ground and brushed away the dust that clung to its edge. She slid the strap across her shoulder once more and stepped carefully back into the row where her work had stopped. For a few seconds, she simply stood there, feeling the rhythm of the field return around her. The cotton plants swayed softly. The distant cicadas hummed in the trees. The sun burned steadily above the endless Texas sky. And somewhere just beyond the rows, Ethan Walker walked slowly back toward the fence line, glancing over his shoulder once to make sure the woman who had fallen in the dust was standing again beneath the wide summer sun. The work resumed slowly after Anna Weiss stepped back into the row, but the rhythm of the field had changed in a way that no one could quite explain. Cotton sacks dragged again across the dry soil, and hands reached for the soft white fibers just as they had before. Yet every movement seemed slightly more careful now, as if the heat had reminded everyone how thin. The line could be between strength and collapse. Anna moved deliberately, taking smaller steps than she had earlier in the morning. She pulled the cotton gently from each plant and placed it into the canvas sack resting against her hip, pausing every few minutes to breathe more deeply before continuing down the row. The dizziness had mostly faded, but a dull weakness lingered in her arms and legs, a quiet echo of the moment when the world had tilted beneath her feet. The Texas sun had climbed higher, and by late morning the field shimmered beneath its brightness. Heat rose from the ground in slow, invisible waves that blurred the distant fence posts and made the horizon ripple like water. Cicadas filled the air with their steady electric song. Somewhere beyond the oak trees a truck engine rumbled faintly along the dirt road and then disappeared again into the distance. Life on the farm continued as it always did, indifferent to the small dramas that unfolded within its fields. Ethan Walker walked along the fence line, checking the posts the way he had planned to earlier that morning. His hands moved automatically over the rough wood, testing each board and wire for looseness. Yet every few minutes his eyes drifted back toward the rows of cotton where the prisoners worked. From a distance it was difficult to pick out one figure among the others, but he knew exactly where Anna stood. She moved slower now, but she had returned to the work with quiet determination. That alone told him more about her than any conversation could have. Some people gave up after a moment like that. Others stood back up and continued because something inside them refused to stay down. Ethan understood that kind of stubborn strength. He had seen it in ranch hands who worked through injuries and in farmers who planted new crops after droughts ruined the last harvest. It was not pride. It was simply the decision to keep moving forward because stopping would feel worse. Around noon the foreman called for a break. The sound of his voice carried across the field in a long drawn-out shout that drifted between the rows of cotton. The workers straightened slowly, stretching their backs and wiping sweat from their faces with sleeves already darkened by dust and heat. The mesquite tree near the water jug offered the only shade within sight, and the small group of prisoners walked toward it together, their canvas sacks left where they had fallen beside the rows. Anna followed at the back of the group. Her steps were steady now, though she moved with a careful awareness of the heat pressing down on her shoulders. When she reached the tree, she lowered herself onto the dry grass beneath its branches and leaned her back against the rough bark. The shade felt like a small miracle after the brightness of the field. A faint breeze moved through the leaves, carrying the smell of sun-warmed earth and distant hay from the barn across the road. Ethan approached a few moments later carrying a second water jug he had filled from the pump behind the farmhouse. The metal handle clinked softly as he set it down beside the first one. Without saying anything, he filled several tin cups and placed them on the ground where the women could reach them easily. The gesture was simple and practical, yet Anna noticed again that he did not hand the cups directly to anyone. He set them down and stepped back slightly, allowing each person to take what they needed without feeling watched. She reached for one of the cups and drank slowly. The water tasted cooler this time, and she closed her eyes for a moment as the dryness in her throat faded. When she opened them again, Ethan was standing a few feet away, leaning against the trunk of the mesquite tree with his arms loosely crossed. His hat shaded his face, but she could see that he was studying the horizon rather than staring at the group resting beneath the branches. The distance he kept seemed deliberate, almost respectful. In the camps where she had stayed after her capture, guards had often stood too close, their presence heavy with authority. Ethan's quiet space felt different. It suggested that he did not see them as people who needed constant watching. After a few minutes, Anna spoke. "The heat is stronger here than any summer I remember," she said softly. Her English came carefully, each word chosen with precision. Ethan glanced toward her and nodded once. "Texas sun has a reputation," he replied. "Folks who grow up here still complain about it every July." Anna allowed herself a small smile at that. The idea that even Texans struggled with their own climate seemed strangely comforting. She looked around at the other women sitting in the shade, some leaning against the trunk, others stretching their legs in the grass. None of them spoke loudly. The break felt almost peaceful, the way a quiet pause can feel after hours of steady work. A hawk circled high above the field, its shadow gliding slowly across the cotton rows. The cicadas continued their constant humming, as if the heat itself had a voice. Ethan pushed himself away from the tree and picked up one of the empty cups. "You should take it slower this afternoon," he said, his voice calm but firm enough that it sounded more like advice than a command. "The cotton will still be here tomorrow." Anna considered his words. She knew the truth in them, yet part of her still felt the pressure to prove she could keep pace with the others. War had created that pressure in many people. It made them afraid of appearing weak, even when weakness was simply the body asking for rest. "I will be careful," she said finally. Ethan gave a small nod, satisfied with that answer. The foreman called out again from the edge of the field, signaling that the break was ending. One by one the women rose from the grass and returned to their rows, lifting the canvas sacks onto their shoulders once more. Anna stood a moment longer beneath the mesquite tree, finishing the last sip of water in her cup. The breeze stirred the leaves above her, and for a brief second the shade deepened around her like a quiet shelter. Then she set the cup down beside the jug and walked back into the sunlight where the cotton waited. Across the field, Ethan watched her return to the row where she had fallen earlier that morning. She moved carefully now, her pace slower but steady. The white plants swayed gently around her as she began working again beneath the wide and relentless Texas sky. The afternoon returned to its slow, relentless rhythm once the short break beneath the mesquite tree ended. The sun had climbed almost straight overhead now, and the cotton field looked brighter than it had that morning, each white fiber reflecting the light so strongly that the rows seemed to glow against the dark soil. Heat pressed downward like an invisible weight. Even the wind had grown quiet, as if the air itself had grown too tired to move. Anna Weiss stepped carefully along her row, her canvas sack resting lighter against her shoulder now that she worked at a slower pace. She no longer tried to match the speed of the others. Instead, she allowed each movement to follow the calm rhythm of her breathing. Reach forward. Pull the cotton free. Drop it into the sack. Take one step. Pause. Breathe again. The pattern repeated over and over until it began to feel almost like a quiet form of meditation. The weakness that had struck her earlier in the day had not completely disappeared, but it had softened into something manageable, a dull reminder in her muscles that the body sometimes demanded patience whether a person wished to grant it or not. Around her the other women worked in silence. Their sacks dragged softly through the dust. Occasionally someone straightened to stretch her back before bending again into the plants. The cicadas hummed louder now in the oak trees beyond the fence line, their steady chorus filling the afternoon with a sound that seemed to vibrate through the air itself. From time to time Anna lifted her head and looked across the field toward the fence where Ethan Walker moved slowly along the posts. He worked with the same calm focus he had shown earlier that morning, tightening wire here, checking a hinge there, walking the line of the fence as if it were a quiet path he had followed all his life. In truth, he had. The Walker family had owned this land for nearly 50 years, and Ethan had grown up riding horses across these same fields long before cotton plants ever filled them. Watching him from a distance, Anna found herself thinking about how different his life must have been from hers. The war had pulled her across oceans and into camps and fields she never imagined seeing. Yet for him the land had remained constant, the horizon always the same wide line stretching beneath the Texas sky. A hawk drifted slowly overhead, its wings barely moving as it rode the warm currents rising from the field. Its shadow slid across the cotton rows and passed briefly over Anna's shoulders before disappearing into the distance. She bent again to gather another handful of cotton, and this time her movement felt steadier than it had since morning. The body, she realized, was quietly forgiving if given enough time. Hours passed in the slow language of farm work. The sun moved westward by small, invisible degrees. Shadows grew longer between the rows, stretching across the soil like dark ribbons laid gently across the land. By mid-afternoon, a faint breeze returned, carrying the smell of distant hayfields and the soft creak of wind moving through barn doors somewhere beyond the trees. Ethan paused near the corner of the fence and rested his hands on the top rail for a moment. From there he could see nearly the entire field. The prisoners had spread out across the rows like gray figures moving through white waves. Most of them worked steadily, though the heat had slowed everyone by now. His eyes drifted naturally toward Anna's row. She had reached the midpoint of the field and was moving with a quiet determination that caught his attention again. The moment when she collapsed that morning had lingered in his mind longer than he expected. It had reminded him how easily the land could humble even the strongest people. He had seen seasoned ranch hands struggle under the same sun that now shone down on those cotton rows. But something about the way Anna had stood up afterward and returned to work had stayed with him. It was not stubborn pride. It was something quieter than that. Something closer to resilience. Ethan pushed away from the fence and walked toward the water station again. The metal jug beneath the mesquite tree had grown nearly empty. He lifted it, feeling the lightness of its weight, and carried it toward the farmhouse pump a few hundred yards away. The pump stood beside the barn, its long handle worn smooth from years of use. He filled the jug slowly, watching the clear water splash against the metal sides until it reached the top. When he returned to the field, he set the jug down once more in the shade of the tree. The workers noticed almost immediately. One by one they drifted toward the water during brief pauses in their rows. Anna approached last. She filled a cup and drank slowly, letting the coolness settle in her throat before returning to the plants. As she turned back toward the field, Ethan spoke from beside the tree. "How are you holding up now?" Anna paused and considered the question carefully. "Much better than this morning," she said. She lifted the cup slightly, as if acknowledging the reason why. "The water helped." Ethan gave a small nod. "The sun has a way of teaching patience out here." Anna looked across the rows of cotton stretching into the distance. In Germany, the fields were smaller, she said thoughtfully. The horizon did not feel so wide. Ethan followed her gaze across the land. "That is one thing Texas has plenty of," he said quietly. "Space." Anna allowed a faint smile to touch her lips before she returned to the row where her sack waited. The afternoon light had softened slightly now, turning the white cotton fibers into small glowing shapes against the darker green leaves. She bent again to gather them, feeling the slow rhythm of the work settle comfortably into her body. Across the field, Ethan resumed walking along the fence line. The heat was still strong, but the hardest part of the day had already passed. And somewhere between the steady hum of cicadas and the endless rows of cotton, an understanding had begun to form between two people who only that morning had been strangers separated by war, distance, and the wide, uncertain spaces of the world. The afternoon light began to change in ways that only people who worked the land every day could truly notice. The sun had shifted westward, and the blinding white brightness of midday softened into a warmer glow that settled gently across the cotton field. The long rows that had seemed endless under the harsh noon light now carried deeper shadows between the plants. The soil cooled slightly beneath the surface, though the air still held the lingering warmth of a Texas summer day. Anna Weiss continued moving steadily down her row. Her canvas sack had grown heavier with cotton, and the strap pressed against her shoulder with a dull weight that reminded her how much of the day had already passed. Yet her steps remained careful and controlled. She had learned her lesson from the morning. Each movement now carried patience. Each breath came slowly and deliberately. The cotton plants brushed softly against her sleeves as she worked, their leaves warm and dry beneath her fingers. Occasionally a breeze passed through the field and lifted the white fibers so they fluttered like small drifting feathers before settling again among the green branches. The sound of cicadas continued in the distance, though it had softened slightly as the afternoon cooled. Somewhere near the barn a horse snorted and stamped its hoof, followed by the faint creak of leather from a saddle shifting against a fence post. Life on the farm moved forward without ceremony, guided by the quiet routines that had shaped the land long before the war had reached American shores. Ethan Walker stood near the far edge of the field beside a narrow gate where the fence line met the dirt road. He had finished most of the repairs he planned for the day. The wires were tight again, and the gate hinge turned smoothly when he pushed it open and closed. Now he rested one arm across the top rail and looked back across the cotton rows stretching toward the mesquite tree. From where he stood, he could see the slow movement of the workers as they continued gathering the harvest. The sun caught on the white cotton and turned the field into a wide patchwork of soft light. His gaze moved naturally toward Anna's row again. She had nearly reached the end now. The sack across her shoulder hung heavy, yet her posture remained steady. The moment from the morning seemed distant now, though Ethan could still picture it clearly. The sudden fall, the stillness of the field, the quiet relief when she opened her eyes again beneath the shade of his hat. It had been a simple moment, yet something about it had stayed with him through the long hours of the afternoon. He watched as Anna paused near the end of the row and lifted the sack from her shoulder. She emptied its contents into a larger wagon bin waiting at the edge of the field. The cotton tumbled out in a soft white pile that rustled faintly as it settled. When she finished, she straightened slowly and rested her hands on her hips for a moment, looking out across the field as if measuring how much work remained before the day would end. From the gate, Ethan could see the weariness in her shoulders even from that distance. He stepped away from the fence and began walking toward the wagon. His boots moved steadily along the narrow path between the rows. Dust rose lightly beneath each step and drifted behind him before settling again on the dry soil. By the time he reached the wagon, Anna had already lifted her sack again and started toward the next row. She stopped when she noticed him approaching. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the ground, stretching the shapes of the wagon wheels and the cotton plants across the dirt like dark ribbons. Ethan rested one hand on the edge of the wagon and nodded toward the bin where the cotton had collected. "That is good work for one day," he said quietly. Anna followed his gesture and looked at the pile of white fibers she had just emptied. It did not look like much compared to the vast field surrounding them, yet she knew how many hours of effort had gone into gathering it. "In Germany," she said slowly, "the farms near my home used smaller fields. Harvest did not take so long." Ethan leaned lightly against the wagon wheel. "Texas land has a way of stretching things out," he replied. "Distance, work, even the days sometimes feel longer here." Anna considered that thought and gave a faint nod. She could not argue with it. The sky above the cotton rows seemed impossibly wide compared to the valleys of her homeland. Sometimes the openness felt almost overwhelming, as if the horizon itself had no intention of ever ending. A breeze passed through the field again, cooler now than it had been earlier. It carried the faint smell of hay and distant pine from the wooded ridge beyond the pasture. Anna closed her eyes briefly as the air touched her face. The sensation felt refreshing after the long hours beneath the sun. When she opened them again, Ethan had stepped closer to the wagon and lifted another empty cotton sack from the side rail. He handed it toward her without speaking. The gesture was practical, the kind that happened 1,000 times during harvest season. Yet Anna accepted it with quiet appreciation. "Thank you," she said. Ethan gave a small nod, adjusting the brim of his hat as he stepped aside again. The afternoon light had softened further now. Golden tones spread across the field as the sun continued its slow descent toward the western hills. The cicadas grew quieter, replaced by the distant chirping of crickets beginning there. Evening chorus. Across the rows the other women continued working, though their pace had slowed as the day approached its end. Anna turned back toward the plants and began gathering cotton again. Her hands moved with calm precision. The rhythm returned easily now. Reach forward. Pull the fibers free. Drop them into the sack. Step forward. The same quiet pattern that had carried her through the afternoon continued beneath the warm glow of the fading sun. Ethan watched for a moment before turning back toward the fence line. The gate creaked softly as he pushed it open and stepped through. Beyond it, the pasture stretched toward the barn where the horses waited for their evening feed. Behind him, the cotton field glowed pale gold beneath the lowering sun, and within those endless rows the figures of the workers moved slowly through the final hours of daylight, their steady labor blending into the quiet, breathing rhythm of the land itself. The day moved slowly toward evening, and the cotton field began to change in subtle ways that only patient eyes would notice. The harsh white glare of the afternoon softened into a warmer color, turning the endless rows into bands of pale gold beneath the sky. Long shadows stretched across the soil now, reaching from the plants like quiet fingers touching the ground. The air itself seemed to relax after the long pressure of the sun, and a faint breeze drifted through the leaves with the smell of dry earth and distant hay. Anna Weiss continued working in her row, though the pace of the entire field had slowed. The sack at her shoulder filled more gradually now as the day reached its final hours. Her movements remained careful and steady, but she could feel the weight of the long day settling into her arms and back. The moment when she collapsed that morning seemed both distant and strangely close at the same time. Her body remembered it, even if her thoughts tried to move past it. Yet she was still standing, still working, still breathing beneath the wide Texas sky. Around her the other women worked quietly, their figures moving slowly through the cotton like shadows drifting between the plants. No one spoke loudly. The field carried a calm that came at the end of a long day when every person understood that the hardest work had already been done. At the edge of the field, a truck engine started somewhere near the dirt road, then faded again as the driver shut it off. The sound reminded everyone that evening was approaching. Ethan Walker stepped through the narrow gate beside the fence and walked back toward the cotton rows. The pasture behind him had grown cooler as the sun moved west, and the horses near the barn had begun gathering near the fence where they expected their evening feed. But Ethan had one more look to take across the field before the day ended. He walked slowly between the rows, his boots pressing lightly into the dusty soil that had baked beneath the heat all afternoon. The plants brushed softly against his trousers as he passed. When he reached the wagon again, he rested his hand against its wooden side and looked across the field once more. Anna was finishing another sack of cotton. She lifted it carefully and carried it toward the wagon, her steps measured but steady. When she reached the bin, she emptied the sack with a quiet rustling sound as the cotton settled into the growing pile. For a moment she stood there with one hand resting against the wagon rail, breathing slowly while she looked across the field where the last sunlight touched the tops of the plants. Ethan stepped closer and leaned against the wheel again. "You worked through the worst part of the day?" he said calmly. "That is not easy in this heat." Anna looked at him and gave a small nod. "I had good help this morning," she replied softly. The words carried more meaning than the simple sentence suggested. Ethan understood it immediately, though he did not make a show of acknowledging it. He simply nodded once and adjusted the brim of his hat against the low sun. "Out here we all help each other when the sun gets too strong," he said. "That is just how things work on a farm." Anna studied his expression carefully for a moment. She had met many people since the war began. Some spoke with kindness only when it served them. Others offered help, but made certain that the debt was remembered afterward. Ethan didn't either. His tone carried no sense of ownership over the moment earlier that day. He spoke as if helping someone stand up from the ground was the most ordinary thing in the world. Perhaps for him it was. A faint smile touched Anna's face again, though it remained small and quiet. "In my town we had vineyards," she said after a moment. In autumn the hills turned dark red when the grapes were ready. The work was difficult there too, but the air was cooler. Ethan glanced across the cotton rows stretching toward the horizon. "I have never seen vineyards like that," he said. "Texas mostly grows things that can survive the heat." Anna followed his gaze across the land. The horizon seemed endless, fading into a pale blue distance where the sky met the earth. "It is very wide here," she said thoughtfully. Ethan gave a short quiet laugh. "That is something people from other places notice quickly." He looked out across the field again as the sunlight softened further into amber tones. When you grow up here, you forget how big it looks until someone points it out. The breeze moved gently through the cotton plants again, and the white fibers fluttered softly like drifting snow in the fading light. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them did not feel uncomfortable. It felt natural, like the quiet spaces between notes in a piece of music. In the distance, the foreman called out that there would be only one more row before the workers could stop for the day. The women across the field lifted their sacks once more and moved forward through the plants, their figures small against the wide landscape. Anna looked toward her row and then back at the wagon. "One more row," she said quietly. Ethan nodded. "One more row." She picked up the empty sack and walked back between the cotton plants. The light had changed again now, turning the white fibers into pale gold beneath the lowering sun. Each step she took stirred a small cloud of dust that glowed briefly in the evening light before settling again onto the soil. Ethan remained beside the wagon, watching the final movements of the day unfold across the field. The cicadas had grown quiet now, replaced by the soft chirping of crickets beginning their song somewhere near the fence line. As Anna reached the final plants in her row, she moved with calm determination, gathering the last handfuls of cotton and placing them carefully into the sack. When she finished, she lifted it once more and carried it toward the wagon where the harvest of the day waited in a soft white pile. The sun hovered low above the horizon now, casting long golden light across the entire field. And for the first time since morning, the land itself seemed to breathe more slowly beneath the cooling evening sky. The last row ended beneath a sky that had turned the color of warm copper. The sun hovered low above the distant tree line, its light spreading gently across the cotton field in long glowing bands. Shadows from the plants stretched across the soil like thin dark rivers flowing between the rows. The air had cooled enough that each breath felt easier than it had during the long heat of midday. Anna Weiss walked slowly beside the wagon after emptying the final sack of cotton. Her arms felt heavy, but the kind of heaviness that comes after honest work rather than exhaustion. The muscles in her shoulders ached in a quiet, steady way that reminded her she had made it through the entire day. That alone felt like an accomplishment after the moment when the ground had rushed up to meet her earlier that morning. The other women finished their rows as well, carrying their sacks to the wagon and shaking out the last of the cotton into the growing white mound. The soft rustling sound of fibers settling into the pile drifted through the evening air. One by one the sacks were folded and hung along the wagon rails where they would be ready for the next day. The foreman stood near the dirt road counting the sacks and nodding quietly as each worker finished. The workday was ending the way most farm days ended, not with celebration, but with a quiet understanding that the sun had reached the point where it was time to stop. Ethan Walker stood near the fence gate again, watching the final movements across the field. The light behind the workers turned their figures into long silhouettes, moving slowly through pale gold cotton. For a moment, he simply leaned against the wooden rail and listened to the sounds of evening settling across the land. Crickets had replaced the cicadas now. A meadowlark called once from somewhere beyond the pasture. The wind moved gently through the mesquite tree beside the water jug, stirring its thin branches so they whispered softly together. Anna walked toward the gate with the others when the foreman called them in. The dirt path between the rows felt different now that the sun was nearly gone. The soil had cooled slightly, and the breeze carried the smell of distant grass and the faint sweetness of cotton drying in the wagon behind them. As she approached the gate, she saw Ethan standing there waiting to swing it open for the group to pass through. It was a small practical gesture, the kind that happened many times on a farm, yet she noticed the way he stepped aside afterward so the workers could walk through without feeling hurried. One by one they crossed into the narrow strip of grass beside the road where the truck would soon arrive. Anna stepped through last. When she passed him she paused briefly, not because she had been told to stop, but because something in the quiet evening air made the moment feel worth acknowledging. The sunset painted the western sky in deep orange and pale violet, colors that spread across the horizon like brush strokes on a wide canvas. For a few seconds, she simply looked at the sky and then back across the cotton field where the long rows now rested beneath fading light. "It is very beautiful here at this time of day," she said softly. Ethan followed her gaze across the field. "Evening tends to forgive the heat," he replied. Everything looks calmer once the sun begins to leave. Anna nodded slowly. In Germany, the evenings were different, she said. The hills caught the last light first, and the valleys grew dark early. Here the light stays longer. Ethan rested one hand against the top rail of the fence as he listened. That is the open land for you, he said. Nothing blocks the sunset out here. They stood quietly for another moment while the other workers gathered near the road. In the distance, the faint rumble of an approaching truck drifted through the evening air. The sound carried slowly across the fields until it grew louder with each passing second. The driver would take the prisoners back to the camp before dark, just as he had done every evening since the harvest began. Anna glanced toward the road, and then back toward the cotton field once more. Today could have ended very differently for her. The memory of collapsing beneath the sun returned briefly, but it no longer carried the same fear it had earlier. Now it felt more like a reminder of how fragile a person could be beneath such a wide sky. Thank you again for helping me this morning, she said quietly. Ethan shifted his hat slightly as the last rays of sunlight touched the brim. Anyone would have done the same, he answered. The sun does not care who you are when it gets that strong. Anna studied his expression for a moment and then gave a small thoughtful nod. Perhaps that was true. Yet something told her not everyone would have crossed the field so quickly when she fell. The truck appeared over the rise in the dirt road then, its engine rumbling steadily as it approached the gate. Dust lifted behind its tires and drifted slowly across the evening light. The driver slowed as he reached the workers and brought the truck to a stop beside the fence. The foreman opened the back gate of the truck bed and signaled for the women to climb aboard. One by one, they stepped up onto the wooden platform and settled onto the narrow benches along the sides. Anna climbed up last and sat near the tailgate where she could still see the cotton field stretching away beneath the fading sky. Ethan closed the fence gate behind them and rested his arms on the top rail again. The driver shifted the truck into gear, and the engine rumbled softly as it began to move down the road toward the distant camp. Anna looked back once as the truck rolled away. The cotton field glowed pale silver beneath the last light of sunset. Near the gate, a single figure still stood beside the fence, his hat dark against the wide evening sky. The distance between them grew slowly as the truck moved farther down the road, yet the quiet understanding that had begun in the heat of that field remained with her as the land behind them faded into the deepening colors of night. The truck rolled steadily along the narrow dirt road as the last light of evening faded behind the cotton fields. Dust rose in a soft cloud behind the tires and drifted slowly through the warm air before settling back onto the road. Anna Weiss sat near the tailgate with her hands resting quietly in her lap, watching the land slide past as the vehicle carried them away from the farm. The sky above the Texas plains had turned deep violet now, and the first faint stars were beginning to appear above the dark line of trees on the horizon. The cotton fields they had worked all day stretched silently behind them, their white rows slowly disappearing into the dim blue light of approaching night. The women sitting beside Anna were tired in the quiet way that follows long hours of labor. Some leaned back against the wooden sides of the truck with their eyes half closed while the breeze cooled the sweat that had gathered on their skin during the day. Others stared silently at the landscape, each lost in private thoughts that traveled far beyond the dusty road beneath the wheels. Anna remained awake, her eyes still turned toward the direction of the farm even after it had disappeared behind a curve in the road. The memory of the evening light on the cotton plants lingered in her mind. She could still picture the field glowing beneath the setting sun and the solitary figure standing beside the fence as the truck pulled away. Ethan Walker had not moved from the gate when she last looked back. His outline had grown smaller with distance, but the quiet stillness of that moment had remained clear. The truck drove on for several miles through farmland broken by scattered barns and low wooden houses. The smell of freshly cut hay drifted through the air as they passed open pastures where cattle moved slowly through the fading light. A few porch lamps flickered on near distant farmhouses, glowing softly against the deepening blue of the evening sky. The road eventually turned toward a cluster of wooden buildings surrounded by tall fencing and guard towers. The prisoner camp stood quietly beneath the rising stars, its lights glowing pale yellow along the fence line. The driver slowed the truck and turned through the open gate where a guard waved them inside. The vehicle rolled to a stop beside the barracks where the women slept during their weeks of farm labor. One by one, they climbed down from the truck bed and stepped onto the packed dirt of the camp yard. Their movements were slower now, their bodies stiff from the long hours of bending and lifting beneath the sun. Anna stepped down last and paused for a moment beside the truck while the driver closed the tailgate behind her. The evening air inside the camp felt cooler than the fields, though the smell of dust and wood smoke still lingered faintly in the breeze. Beyond the fence, the wide Texas sky stretched overhead, filled now with scattered stars that seemed brighter than any she remembered from home. Inside the barracks, the other women moved quietly through the simple routine that followed every workday. Boots were removed near the doorway. Work shirts were folded and placed carefully on the ends of narrow bunks. A lantern hanging from the ceiling cast warm light across the wooden walls as someone filled a basin with water from a metal pitcher. Anna washed the dust from her hands and face, watching the water turn cloudy as the soil of the cotton field dissolved into the basin. The cool touch of the water felt soothing against her skin. When she finished, she sat down on the edge of her bunk and let her shoulders rest for a moment while the quiet sounds of the barracks settled around her. A few of the women spoke softly in German, their voices low enough that the conversation blended gently with the creak of wooden floorboards and the distant hum of night insects outside the window. Anna lay back slowly against the thin mattress and looked toward the ceiling where shadows from the lantern flickered across the beams. Her body carried the deep fatigue of the day, yet her mind remained awake. Images of the cotton field returned one by one. The brightness of the sun, the rough texture of the soil beneath her hands, the sudden dizziness that had swept through her body like a wave she could not stop, and then the shadow of a wide hat blocking the sunlight above her face. She could still hear the quiet voice telling her to breathe slowly and drink the water placed beside her. The memory did not carry embarrassment as she had feared it might. Instead, it felt strangely steady, as though that moment had anchored the entire day in place. On the farm, the distance between enemies had seemed smaller than the distance between exhaustion and relief. Ethan had not spoken of war or nations or victory. He had simply crossed a field because someone had fallen. Anna turned her head toward the small window beside her bunk. Through the glass, she could see a narrow slice of the night sky beyond the camp fence. The stars seemed endless above the dark horizon. Somewhere out there, miles away, the cotton fields rested quietly beneath the same sky. She imagined the farm settling into its evening routines just as the camp now settled into silence. Horses would be in their stalls. Lanterns would glow softly inside the farmhouse kitchen. The wagon filled with cotton would stand beside the barn waiting for morning. And near the fence line, a cowboy might be walking slowly across the pasture, checking gates before the night fully arrived. The thought lingered gently in her mind as the lantern light in the barracks dimmed, and one by one the women around her drifted into sleep. Outside the camp, the Texas night stretched wide and calm beneath the stars, carrying with it the quiet memory of a day that had begun with heat and collapse and ended beneath the peaceful stillness of the open sky. Morning returned quietly to the camp long before the sun rose above the Texas horizon. The sky outside the barracks window had barely begun to lighten when Anna Weiss opened her eyes. For a moment she remained still beneath the thin blanket, listening to the soft breathing of the other women around her. The barracks carried the calm silence that exists just before a new day begins, when even the insects outside seem to pause between their nighttime songs and the first sounds of morning. Through the narrow window above her bunk, she could see a faint gray glow spreading slowly across the eastern sky. Dawn was coming. She sat up carefully and rested her feet on the wooden floor. The boards were cool beneath her soles, a welcome contrast to the heat she remembered from the previous afternoon. Her muscles felt stiff from the long hours in the cotton field, but the weakness from the day before had faded. In its place was the familiar ache of labor that her body understood. The other women began waking soon after. One shifted quietly on a nearby bunk, then another. Someone poured water from a metal pitcher into the wash basin near the wall, and the gentle splash echoed softly through the room. Anna washed her hands and face again, watching the pale morning light grow stronger through the window as the sky turned from gray to soft blue. Outside the camp yard, a truck engine coughed to life, followed by the low rumble of idling machinery waiting to carry them back to the farms. The routine had already become familiar. Boots were pulled on. Work shirts were buttoned. Hair was tied back to keep it clear of the cotton plants. Within a few minutes, the women stepped outside into the early morning air. The world beyond the barracks smelled of damp soil and fresh grass. The sun had not yet risen fully, but the eastern horizon glowed faintly with orange light. A cool breeze moved across the camp yard, brushing gently against their faces. Anna drew in a long breath and felt the calm strength of morning settle into her chest. Yesterday's heat seemed almost impossible to imagine in the cool air of dawn. The truck waited beside the gate with its wooden sides already dusty from the previous day's journey. One by one, the women climbed into the back and took their seats along the narrow benches. Anna again sat near the tailgate where she could see the road behind them. When the driver shifted the truck into gear and rolled toward the gate, the camp guard lifted a hand in silent acknowledgement. The vehicle rumbled out onto the dirt road and began its slow journey across the farmland toward the cotton fields. The rising sun followed them from the horizon, painting the landscape with gentle golden light. Pastures stretched wide on either side of the road. Cattle moved slowly through the grass, while distant barns stood quiet beneath tall windmills, turning lazily in the breeze. The truck carried them through the same winding path they had traveled the day before. Yet this morning the land seemed different to Anna. Perhaps it was the cool air or the memory of the previous day, but the open Texas sky felt less overwhelming now. It felt familiar in a quiet way. As the truck crested a small hill, the cotton fields came into view again. Endless rows stretched across the land beneath the rising sun, their white fibers glowing softly in the morning light. The farm appeared peaceful at that hour, untouched by the heat that would return later in the day. The truck slowed as it approached the gate beside the familiar fence line. Anna's eyes moved automatically toward the spot where she had last seen Ethan Walker standing the evening before. The gate opened with the same gentle creak as the truck rolled through. Ethan stood nearby with one hand resting against the fence rail. His hat cast a shadow across his face, but the morning light revealed the steady calm in his posture. He nodded toward the driver in greeting and stepped aside so the truck could pass. Anna noticed him the moment the vehicle turned into the field road. Their eyes met briefly as the truck rolled past the gate. There was no dramatic gesture, no spoken greeting carried across the engine noise. Only a small nod from each of them, a quiet recognition that yesterday's moment had not been forgotten. The truck came to a stop beside the cotton rows where the wagon and sacks waited. The foreman called out the start of the day's work while the women climbed down from the truck and lifted the canvas sacks from the wagon rails. The sun had risen higher now, warming the tops of the cotton plants with golden light. Dew still clung to some of the leaves, sparkling briefly before evaporating into the morning air. Anna stepped into the row she had worked the day before and adjusted the strap of the sack across her shoulder. For a moment, she simply stood there, looking down the long corridor of cotton plants stretching ahead. The field looked endless again, but this time it did not feel intimidating. It felt like a path she already understood. Behind her, the gate creaked once more as Ethan pushed it closed. He walked slowly along the fence line, just as he had the previous morning, checking the posts while the work began across the field. The quiet rhythm returned almost immediately. Hands reached forward into the cotton plants. White fibers fell into the sacks. Boots moved steadily across the soil. Anna bent down and pulled the first handful of cotton from the plant before her. The motion felt natural now, as though her body remembered it without effort. The day had begun again beneath the wide Texas sky, and somewhere along the fence line a cowboy moved slowly beside the rows, his shadow stretching across the ground as the sun climbed higher into the clear morning light. The morning grew brighter with each passing hour as the sun climbed steadily above the cotton fields. What had begun as a cool and gentle dawn slowly transformed into the familiar warmth of a Texas workday. The light spread across the rows like a wide golden sheet, touching each cotton plant until the entire field shimmered beneath the sky. Anna Weiss moved carefully down her row, her canvas sack brushing softly against her hip with every step. The rhythm of the work returned easily now. Reach forward. Pull the cotton free. Drop the fibers into the sack. Step forward again. The pattern repeated quietly beneath the open sky. Around her, the other women worked in the same steady motion, their gray shirts moving slowly through the white rows like shadows crossing pale water. The breeze from the morning had begun to fade, replaced by the still warmth that signaled another hot afternoon would soon arrive. Yet the air still felt lighter than it had the day before. The land carried the calm feeling of a new beginning. Anna bent to gather another cluster of cotton and lifted it carefully from the plant. The fibers felt soft and dry against her fingers. She placed them into the sack and straightened slowly, letting her eyes travel across the field for a moment. Near the far fence line, she could see Ethan Walker moving along the wooden posts again. His pace was unhurried, the same patient rhythm he had carried the day before. Every few yards he stopped to check a wire or tighten a hinge, then continued down the fence as though the work had always belonged to him. The sun caught the brim of his hat and turned it briefly bright against the sky before the shadow returned across his face. Anna lowered her gaze back to the cotton plants and continued working, yet a quiet awareness remained in her thoughts. The field felt less empty today. The long rows no longer seemed quite so endless. Hours passed in the slow language of farm work. The sun climbed higher. Heat gathered gently above the soil. The cicadas began their midday chorus again in the oak trees near the road, filling the air with their steady humming sound. Anna continued moving through the row with calm patience, careful not to rush the pace she had chosen that morning. Her strength remained steady, and the dizziness from the previous day did not return. Instead, there was only the steady rhythm of work and breathing beneath the sky. Around midday, the foreman called for a break once again. The women straightened slowly and began walking toward the mesquite tree where the water jugs waited in the shade. The tree's thin branches cast narrow shadows across the ground, but after the growing heat of the field the shade felt generous. Anna reached the water jug and filled a tin cup before sitting quietly beneath the tree. The water tasted cool and clean. She drank slowly, letting the moment of rest settle through her muscles. A few yards away, Ethan approached from the fence line, carrying a second jug he had just filled at the farmhouse pump. He placed it beside the first one and nodded briefly toward the group resting in the shade. The gesture was simple, almost routine, yet Anna noticed the quiet care behind it just as she had the day before. She lifted her cup again and drank the last of the water. When she lowered it, Ethan was standing near the trunk of the tree adjusting the brim of his hat. The two of them exchanged a small nod that carried more meaning than words might have. "You are stronger today," he said after a moment, his voice calm beneath the sound of cicadas. Anna smiled faintly. "I remembered what you said about the sun teaching patience." Ethan gave a quiet nod of approval. The land has a way of reminding people to listen when they forget. Anna leaned back slightly against the rough bark of the tree and looked out across the field where the cotton rows stretched toward the horizon. "In my country, the fields were surrounded by hills," she said thoughtfully. "You could see where the land ended. Here it feels as though the land continues forever." Ethan followed her gaze across the wide plains. "Texas has plenty of space," he replied. "Sometimes more than a person expects." Anna considered the thought for a moment, and then looked toward the road where the truck had dropped them off earlier that morning. The memory of arriving the previous day returned quietly to her mind. Yesterday this place had felt unfamiliar and overwhelming. Today it felt strangely familiar. The foreman called out again to signal the end of the break. One by one the women stood and returned to their rows. Anna rose as well and brushed the dust from her hands before lifting the canvas sack back onto her shoulder. The shade of the mesquite tree fell away as she stepped back into the sunlight. The cotton plants waited quietly in their long lines beneath the growing heat of the afternoon. She bent down and reached for the first plant in her row. The fibers came free easily in her hands. She dropped them into the sack and moved forward again with calm, steady steps. Near the fence line, Ethan resumed walking along the posts, his shadow stretching across the ground as the sun climbed higher into the wide, clear sky. And across the cotton field, the quiet rhythm of work continued beneath the endless Texas horizon. The afternoon deepened slowly across the cotton field, and the sunlight settled into a warmer tone that softened the sharp brightness of midday. Heat still lingered in the air, but it carried a quieter weight now, as though the land itself had accepted the long hours of labor and allowed the day to move gently toward evening. Anna Weiss worked steadily through her row, the canvas sack at her shoulder growing heavier with each handful of cotton she placed inside. The rhythm that had guided her since morning continued without interruption. "Reach forward. Pull the fibers free. Drop them softly into the sack. Step forward again. Around her the field moved with the same quiet harmony. The other women bent and straightened among the rows, their figures rising and falling beneath the open sky like slow waves across a pale sea. The cicadas hummed in the distant trees, their voices weaving into the steady whisper of cotton leaves brushing together in the breeze. From the far fence line, Ethan Walker continued his slow walk along the wooden posts, his hands occasionally pausing to test a wire or adjust a hinge before moving on again. The sun glowed against the brim of his hat, turning its edge briefly gold before shadow returned beneath it. Hours passed in this quiet rhythm until the long rows of cotton began to glow with the softer light of late afternoon. The shadows between the plants stretched farther across the soil, and the air cooled just enough for each breath to feel easier than it had beneath the midday sun. Anna lifted her sack once more and carried it toward the wagon standing near the center of the field. The bin had already begun to fill with the soft white harvest of the day. She emptied the cotton into the growing pile and paused for a moment beside the wagon rail, letting the breeze move across her face while she looked out over the land. The wide Texas horizon stretched endlessly in every direction, the sky above it turning slowly from bright blue into the pale amber tones of approaching evening. It reminded her once again how different this place was from the valleys of her homeland. Yet the difference no longer felt unsettling. It felt peaceful in a way she had not expected. Footsteps sounded softly in the dust beside the wagon, and Anna turned to see Ethan approaching along the narrow path between the rows. His pace carried the same calm patience she had noticed from the first moment he crossed the field the day before. He stopped beside the wagon and rested one hand lightly on the wooden rail. "The cotton harvest looks stronger today," he said quietly, glancing at the white pile settling in the wagon bed. Anna nodded and brushed a small strand of cotton from her sleeve. "The morning was easier than yesterday," she replied. "I remembered to listen to the heat before it spoke too loudly." Ethan allowed a small, thoughtful smile. "That is a lesson the land teaches slowly," he said. Anna looked out across the rows where the other women continued their work. "Yesterday, I thought the field might defeat me," she said after a moment. "Today it feels different." Ethan followed her gaze across the cotton plants glowing beneath the afternoon sun. "Sometimes the land does not change," he said. "Only the way a person walks across it." Anna considered the thought carefully. The words carried a quiet truth she had begun to feel, but had not yet placed into language. For a few seconds neither of them spoke. The wind moved softly through the field, carrying the dry scent of cotton and warm soil. In the distance the foreman called out to signal the final rows before the end of the day. The voices of the workers drifted faintly across the land as they lifted their sacks and moved forward once more through the plants. Anna picked up her canvas sack again and adjusted the strap across her shoulder. "There are only a few rows left," she said. Ethan nodded toward the field. "Then the day will belong to the evening again." Anna stepped back into her row and bent to gather another cluster of cotton. The fibers slipped easily into her hands, soft and light as they fell into the sack. With each step she moved closer to the end of the row where the wagon waited again beneath the warm light of the setting sun. The sky had begun to change colors now, spreading shades of gold and pale orange across the horizon. The cotton field reflected the glow, turning the white fibers into small pieces of sunlight scattered across the plants. Ethan remained beside the wagon for a moment longer before turning back toward the fence line. His shadow stretched long across the soil as he walked, moving slowly through the quiet evening light. Behind him Anna continued her work beneath the wide sky, her steps steady and patient as the final hours of the day settled gently across the cotton field. The final rows of cotton fell silent as the day slowly surrendered to evening. The sun had lowered itself to the edge of the horizon, spreading warm amber light across the wide Texas fields. Long shadows stretched between the plants, and the air carried the soft, cooling breath that always arrived after a day of hard work beneath the open sky. Anna Weiss lifted the last handful of cotton from the plant before her and placed it carefully into the canvas sack resting against her shoulder. For a moment she stood still, looking down the row she had just finished. The plants swayed gently in the breeze, their white fibers glowing faintly in the fading light. Around her the other women completed their rows as well, carrying their sacks toward the wagon where the harvest of the day waited in a soft white mound. The quiet rustle of cotton falling into the wagon bin drifted through the evening air. When Anna reached the wagon, she lifted the sack from her shoulder and emptied it slowly. The fibers tumbled into the pile with a soft whispering sound. When the sack was empty, she folded it along the rail and rested her hands against the wooden side for a moment. The long day had settled into her muscles, yet the fatigue carried a calm satisfaction. Yesterday morning, she had collapsed beneath the weight of the sun. Now she stood at the end of another full day, steady and breathing easily beneath the wide sky. A few yards away, Ethan Walker stood near the fence line watching the field as it grew quieter. The last workers moved slowly toward the gate, while the foreman checked the wagon and nodded that the work was finished. The evening light touched the brim of Ethan's hat as he stepped forward to open the gate once again. The hinge creaked softly as it swung wide. One by one the women passed through toward the road where the truck would soon arrive. Anna stepped through last, just as she had the evening before. For a moment she paused beside the gate and turned back toward the field. The cotton rows stretched across the land like pale ribbons beneath the sunset. The sky above them glowed with deep gold and violet, colors spreading slowly across the horizon as the sun prepared to disappear beyond the distant trees. It was beautiful in a quiet way that required no words. Ethan closed the gate gently and rested his arms across the top rail. "Looks like the field treated you better today," he said calmly. Anna nodded once. "I listened to it more carefully this time." Ethan allowed a faint smile. "That usually helps." Anna looked across the land one more time. "When I first saw this place, I thought it was too wide for me," she said softly. "It felt like standing at the edge of something endless." Ethan followed her gaze toward the horizon where the sky seemed to stretch forever. "The land can feel that way when a person first arrives," he replied. "But after a while it starts to feel like it belongs to the same sky everywhere else." Anna considered that quietly. Perhaps that was true. Perhaps the sky above Texas was not so different from the sky above the vineyards she once knew. The distance between them was great, yet the evening light looked strangely familiar. The sound of the approaching truck reached them then, its engine rumbling along the dirt road just beyond the fence. Dust lifted gently into the fading sunlight as the vehicle appeared around the bend. The foreman waved it forward and opened the back gate of the truck bed. The women climbed aboard one by one and settled along the wooden benches. Anna stepped up last and turned once more toward the field before taking her seat. Ethan remained beside the fence watching quietly as the driver closed the tailgate. The truck engine rumbled to life again and the vehicle began to roll slowly down the road. Anna sat near the back, just as she had the night before. The cotton field grew smaller behind them with each passing yard, its pale rose fading into the dimming light. She could see the gate where Ethan still stood, his figure steady against the wide evening sky. The distance between them grew slowly, yet the memory of that moment in the field remained clear in her mind. A cowboy crossing the cotton rows without hesitation, a hat held against the sun, a cup of water placed beside someone who had fallen. Simple things, yet they carried a weight that would last longer than the harvest itself. The truck continued down the road toward the distant camp, while the sky above the fields turned deeper shades of blue and violet. The first stars appeared once more along the horizon, just as they had the night before. Anna watched them quietly as the land rolled past in the growing darkness. Somewhere behind them the cotton fields rested beneath the open sky, waiting for another morning when the sun would rise again and the work would begin once more. And though the world remained divided by war and distance, one small corner of that wide Texas land had revealed something different beneath the heat of the sun. Not victory, not defeat, only the quiet truth that kindness could cross a field faster than hatred ever could.